All right, let's talk about today's topic, systems, dynamics, and approaches. As members of a global community, we've been impacted by the pandemic. All of us have disruption across critical supply chains, financial markets, customer relationships, and business and government. They're acutely aware of interdependence. It's not uncommon in such times of disruption to focus on the here and now, but in fact, it's even more important to keep the long term in view. And understanding dynamic systems assures high sustained performance for firms and resilient communities. And so we're very fortunate to be joined today by a professor who spends a lot of time thinking about systems dynamics approaches, and that's Ivey's own Tima Bansal. Tima is a professor of strategy at the Ivey Business School. She's part of the Ivey Centers on Building Sustainable Value and the executive director and founder of the Network for Business Sustainability, a growing network of approximately 8,000 researchers and managers from nations around the world committed to advancing sustainable business. She's received significant accolades for her scholarship in business sustainability. Most recently, in 2019, she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. In 2017, she was presented with the organization's Natural Environment Distinguished Scholar Award by the Academy of Management, and on and on. If we continue reading her bio, we won't get to the discussion today. So thanks, Tima, for joining us. We're fortunate to have you. Tima, again, thanks so much for making time and joining us today. Can you help set the stage for the conversation today? What is dynamic systems design?
First of all, thank you, Mark, for inviting me to this. This is very exciting because it's a topic that I've been thinking about for quite a bit of time now. And I'm actually going to start off by just saying that dynamic systems design becomes really important at a time in which we have a lot of turbulence and a lot of disruptions. So I just want to start with a poll and see what disruptions are on people's minds right now. So, Sean, are you able to launch the poll?
Sure. So we've actually been running the poll for a few minutes now while people get logged in, and we can bring it up right now. So our viewers are now looking at an image of the poll, a word cloud that's been generated from the poll. The question was, looking forward, what major disruptions are most on your radar? The biggest one we're seeing is COVID-19 second wave. Interestingly, climate change and digital transformation as kind of two second and third responses that stand out.
That's fantastic. And it's really fascinating because if you think about those disruptions, there's something that's unique to all of them. And across the board, I think the things that are most on our mind are disruptions that have two characteristics. And I would say one of them is that they're macro, that they're things that we feel affected by rather than we feel that we have control over. So COVID, when it first hit us, was something that affected us. And the same thing happens with COVID wave number 2. The same thing would happen with climate change. It affects us. And yet we know that what we do affects it as well, right? So it's an interactive effect. So the second point that really becomes important with these disruptions is that it's not the things that matter, it's the stuff between the things, it's the interconnections. And we are seeing over the last 2 decades, 3 decades, the frequency and the intensity of disruptions has increased. So we're seeing more of them, we're seeing them more often. And that's because things are becoming connected. And so when you think about pandemics, financial crises that come out of the pandemics, we see the weather events related to climate change, we see social movements, the whole social movement around Me Too, Black Lives Matter, even arguably some of the issues within government goes viral, and it goes viral because of the connections. So Mark, you asked a great question. What is dynamic systems design? It's recognizing that we're part of a system and that it's the connections that matter and not just the objects. And I don't know, most of us have heard of this concept that if a butterfly flaps its wings in China, that we have the hurricane in New Mexico or wherever, that that is because things can amplify. And when things amplify, movements amplify, that's why we're seeing these huge disruptions. And it really shifts, dynamic systems design shifts the way that we think from a plan, check, do, act process to a sense and respond. It's a dynamic system to which we have to respond. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, it does. It's, it sounds like there's a fair amount of kind of in the moment, which is, I would say, not natural for a lot of businesses. What does this have to do with kind of sustainability, thinking about long-term goals, community health, and engagement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as you know, Mark, I've been studying sustainability since the early 1990s. And so it's almost 30 years. And so I think about sustainability a lot. And sustainability was often pitched as corporate social responsibility. It's the right thing to do. And as I learn more about it, the issue is not just the right thing to do. It's the fact that sustainability is a macro concept. It's this thing in the bigger system. And yet we have a tendency to look at what is just happening to us in the moment, right? And we do that as executives, as managers, even as people. We're just focused on us when it's the bigger system that matters. And then I realized at some point that if we understand the system and the interactions of ourselves with the system and recognize that systems are dynamic, that we will actually get to sustainability without having to treat it as something separate from what we do in business. And it becomes part of business. I liken this to playing sport. And, if you're playing a sport, let's say like soccer or football is, in England or, in Europe, but if you're playing soccer, you don't plan on where the ball is. You don't control where the ball can go usually. There's so many forces at play. And because there's so many forces at play, you have to be really trained to respond in the moment. And you have to understand not just your actions, but your opponent's actions. And then you have to understand the field of play. And you may even be influenced by the people in the audience who are watching, right? So the weather, just everything comes into play when you're on the field. So this paradigm that we have in business of plan, do, check, act is not salient, I think, to today's world, which requires us to have these dynamic capabilities. And I think that that's really where I want to get to. And if we build these dynamic capabilities, we will understand that the bigger healthcare systems, climate change, pandemics affect us, and we affect them. If we can understand how to move through that dynamic system, that will be key. And so it's not about predicting and controlling. It's about sensing and responding. Yeah.
I spent a fair amount of time with a company in Guelph last week. They're a power transformer company, and we were not on this topic specifically, but the idea of it was strategic planning and the idea of sort of success and what does that look like. And we took a far sort of shorter time horizon than normal to try to account for COVID. And one of the I think interesting things that sort of came out of that was they thought they weren't going to be successful unless their customers and their suppliers were successful too, and they thought they had a role to play in that, and they couldn't ignore that in kind of this day and age. So, how do you think about success, or how do you think companies should be defining success, and do you have any good examples?
It's a really interesting question, because I've been teaching strategy. I started my career teaching strategy. And strategy has often been around success. And what is success in strategy? It's profits or it's growth. And in many ways they're related. And of course, shareholders demand profits, and that's often done by growing your firm. So now, if we recognize that your success is actually related to other people's success, as you just said, Mark, then what you do is think about system success. And if you can work with the system, then you're going to be successful over the longer term. And so it's it's defining success so that it's mutually inclusive as opposed to exclusive. And another example, though, is, and this is really simple, but if you have a family, and however you define your family, you know that you can, it's not, when you're successful as a parent, that's not enough. You need your kids to be happy. Otherwise, they're going to take away from your happiness at some point, right? And so we can, as parents or family members, move between the success of the family to the success of the individual and back and forth, and not see them in contests. And always, sometimes there's trade-offs, but you accept those trade-offs, you make those decisions, and you make those decisions over the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So if your kid is asking for the iPad, and you know that it will shut the child up for the moment, you know, though, that there could be a long-term consequence of giving them the candy or the iPad now. And so we play in the long term as individuals, but we somehow can lose sight of that when we're running a business.
Yeah, it strikes me that quarterly earnings reports and pressures on reporting and pressures on results that are very short term sort of fly in the face of what you're saying a bit.
And I'll tell you, there's two parts of this. One is that you end up in a disruption of some sort, whether it's technological or COVID. All of a sudden you start to think really short term. Mm-hmm. And yet we know that issues like climate change, or we even know about the pandemic, we knew that that was likely on the horizon. And yet we weren't able to think long enough to respond to it. So we only, and when we respond to disruptions in the moment, you end up just going from crisis to crisis to crisis, and that shortens your time frame.
Some of that is that a lot of the decision making that goes on in business is linear, right? It's taught to be linear. It's intentional that it's linear. And I know you think a lot about the economy as sort of circular in the future, not linear. And I think you have some examples about clothing companies and brands and comparing and contrasting them. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I teach in the MBA program, and I actually co-teach my classes, and it's great because I co-teach them with the core instructors. And I was teaching information systems with Nicole Haggerty, or my colleague, and we're teaching Zara. And of course, we're talking about information systems within Zara. But what's fascinating about fast fashion, Zara's success, is that they produce 24 new collections a year. That means basically every 2 weeks there's a new collection. And can you imagine the speed at which you would have to move to be able to produce that? And that speed then means that after 2 weeks, the old collection is not very helpful because it's being replaced by a new collection. So what do you do with the clothes from the old collection? Well, it sort of is perishables. So that if you don't sell the clothes from the old collection, then they become less and less valued over time. Well, you put them on sale. And if you can't sell them on sale even, then where do they go? They go into landfill. And ultimately what that does is you take natural resources from the earth, you process them, and then you waste them. And that's value that's wasted. And that churn of take, make, waste is a problem. Okay, there's another model of doing this. By the way, here's some really interesting fun facts. 87% of all clothes that are produced go into landfill within a year. Can you imagine that, Mark? 87%.
That's a real number. That's a crazy number.
Yeah. Wow. We only, on average, people wear something 7 times. And then when you think about that most clothes are made out of fossil fuels, polyester. And where does that polyester go? It goes into land, but it also goes into water. 1/3 of the industrial water pollution is from microplastics is related to textiles. That is crazy. That is really crazy. When you think about in developing countries where a lot of textiles are developed, are manufactured, the waste in water pollution is tremendous. Okay, so it's a new, different model from Zara, and this is what's really fascinating, is that circular economy that you're talking about. That what if one, this is Eileen Fisher does this, that women's clothing company, Mark, is that the company produces clothes that are really enduring, and so that they're basics, that you can keep wearing them and they won't go out of fashion. So they're not caught in a speed trap. They're able to think long term. They're able to slow down. And Gucci has decided that they're going to stop making seasonless clothes, and there's lots of high fashion that are doing that. That let's just make cool clothes, right? That can be worn across seasons. I'll tell you, as a consumer too, it's kind of nice just to be able to look in my closet rather than always looking online. But then there's even a further step from that. Adidas has decided that by 2024, within 4 years, that they're going to they're going to actively get rid of plastics that are virgin. So that means getting rid of all new fossil fuels, and all plastics that go into their supply chain are reused plastics. That's fantastic. So that takes it away from taking the fossil fuels, processing it, which is high into energy and high toxins, wasting it, more toxins, to just saying, let's make it circular, so that when the waste comes back into what we do. HP, Hewlett Packard, does the same thing, that they are trying to go through this circular approach. That's long-term thinking. That's building, playing with the relationships, the interconnections, the systems in which we live.
You think about what you just said, and you think about sensing and responding. Is COVID providing an opportunity for people to step back and think and sense and respond, or is it having the opposite effect where it's scaring organizations so badly they stop thinking and just put the blinders on and think we just have to survive right now?
Well, in any kind of crisis, we often just we narrow our point of view, right? So there's this turbulence that happens, that when we keep experiencing changes and we're hit from all sides. And going back to the soccer analogy of sorts, if you feel like you're being attacked on all sides, you start to narrow your focus. And I think that firms that apply this dynamic systems approach actually widen their focus. And if you don't mind, Mark, I want to show a clip in a moment from Ford and Ferrari. I just watched this on the weekend. And in this clip, we have Christian Bale's character, Ken Miles, who's racing for Ford, who's speaking to his son, and they have this race car on an airport runway, and Ken Miles is explaining what it's like to be a race car driver. So, Sean, can you play that? Thanks, Sean. And first of all, I love Christian Bale as an actor, but this notion that when things are going really rough, that we tend to narrow our focus, Mark. We tend to look more short term. We tend to be afraid. That's actually a natural response. That's a human response. But the people and the organizations like race car drivers are able to do this. And I think that that's what we need to do, both in what we teach or how we teach in business schools. But also, I think executives who really get it are able to see that long picture and see past COVID and say, not what do we do to respond to COVID right now? What do I do to respond to COVID post-COVID, and put everything in place so they see COVID as maybe the opportunity to just make their business that much better.
I think about the CEO that I dealt with last week at this this power transformer company. What advice would you have, sort of for him, either with his management team, who are, I would say they have a traditional approach to planning, or for his board, for that matter, who are kind of used to a system of governance? What's kind of the best argument for a leader in an organization to make in terms of adopting a dynamic systems approach?
What's the best argument to make? If you're producing products or offering services, and the products or services only deal with the short-term needs, and let's just talk about Zara again, is that there's clearly a market for fast fashion. If you sort of see beyond that and say, okay, this is where things are going to go into the future, and I can see the social movements at play, and I'm also contributing to the demise or destruction of the planet through this constant churn of fabric. If you are able to see in the future and see what's happening in the bigger system, then you will have products and offer services that will be enduring. And one of the really cool examples, this is actually from decades ago, I still remember this when I was a child, is that, do you remember, Mark, Xerox? When Xerox didn't sell the photocopier, they rented the photocopier.
Yep.
And that it was like that, to me, is this future, is that once you rent the photocopier, then you will ensure that it runs forever because your costs are lower. But not only are your costs lower, if you've got a good photocopier, you have an endless stream of income. And so that keeps you alive through thick and thin. So it's rethinking the business model. And when you rethink the business model, you end up with a longer income stream, and you end up acquiring customers that you wouldn't have normally acquired. So the customer on the margin will go to the company that actually fits the larger interests. And there's such a social movement in that space right now. And then the final reason why you would do this is because of the employee perspective. The smart people know what's going on in the world. And the smart people want to work for companies that are responding to what's going on in the world. They're future looking, are inspirational, believe that they can shape the system rather than just respond to the system. And we all know this. We all know that we want to work with a company that is inspirational. You look at the soccer player again, and the soccer player isn't just running to the ball, but running to where the ball will go and then controlling the play. That's the person that you want, whose team on which you want to belong. You know, you hear about Gretzky, and Gretzky, you know, what said, you go to where the hockey puck will be, not to where it is. And I think that that's what we have to encourage with in business, is to go where we need to go, where things will be, not where they are.
It's you know, it's fascinating. You talked about sort of ROI and talent, right? So in this discussion that we were in last week, there was a big debate about how hard and how quick to move this organization that I was working with into the renewables space. And there's a bit of irony, because to move into the renewable space actually requires currently a step back in technology for them. It requires them to get into oil-based transformers as opposed to dry transformers, and oil-based transformers are not very good for the environment, but that's sort of the requirement to get into wind and solar and so on. And so it would take them off strategy. It would cost them some money, and it's kind of against their principles. Yet it would help access a market that they believe in, you know. And the decision in the end wasn't abandon the renewables market because it doesn't fit short-term ROI and it doesn't fit strategy. It was adapt the strategy, try to transform the buying behavior to adopt dry technology as opposed to oil-based technology. And there was a talent piece too, which is, hey, look, everyone here is sort of getting toward retirement age. We're not going to be able to attract the next wave of management talent if we just abandon a space that everybody thinks is the future. It just may take longer. And so they took a 5-year ROI on the discussion as opposed to a 1-year ROI on the discussion, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, and so much of what you said is important. A couple of things, though, is that, first of all, it's not linear, and that sometimes you have to take a short-term hit. And that's a long-term play. It's like when you're training for any kind of sport, too, that you have to sort of step out of the game in order to build the skills to get back in the game. So, you know, I totally get that. And this notion of a longer-term ROI, and I'm not at liberty to give the example, but there's a major bank in Canada that had 2 different ROIs. And they had the ones for which they were looking for that short-term returns, which was a normal return. And then they had the investments that they just separated out and said, we're going to have the longer term returns, the longer term ROI on these sorts of investments that have bigger impact and longer term impact. That's a really hard road to walk down. But I'm not saying that firms should forget what's in front of them and respond immediately, because we had to with COVID. I think that this ability to do both is what's really important. And there's a tendency to squeeze out the long in order to look at the short.
I want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a little bit over the last few weeks about Ivey Learning Lab, and I just wanted to dig into that a little bit. How does the Learning Lab fit into your research, and can you talk a bit about how that design came about in the first place, which is quite innovative?
So thank you for asking about that. It's my baby at the moment. The Ivey Innovation Learning Lab was built on this opening premise that we have the way that organizations innovate or solve problems is largely in two different ways. One is called new product development. It's a stage gate model. And this is typical, and it goes almost for every organization that's even truly on the frontier of innovation. But you have an annual budgeting cycle, and you decide this is where you're going to invest your money. So let's say in renewables for this power generator. And so you keep on making the investments, and every time you go through a tighter, higher gate, and it becomes very sequential. And so then what you try to do is avoid harm, but it tends to also lead to incremental improvements. And so you end up with a different printer size, or a faster processor, or more efficient mining operations. That's the stage gate model. Another one is design thinking. So that's very user focused, and it says, I want to meet the user needs. And so I've got, an iPhone, and it's, it's not really, we can do more with it. So let's just figure out what the users are doing. So it's user-based design. And that's a little bit more nonlinear, but the problem is those are business problems, business challenges, and that's usually dealing with issues around lower sales, more competition, whatever it might be, even a disruption. They solve a business problem with a business solution. Another approach is what the NGOs do, and they say, we have a complex system in which we operate, and we're going to offer healthcare for all. And that allows for the systems perspective. What I believe that we need to do is to figure out how to apply this systems perspective to businesses. And so how do you do that if we don't actually know exactly how to do that? So I got the smartest people in the country, so to speak. There's about 20 of us and their organizations, and the likes of the ones that we would think, but they're non-competitors. So we have RBC, Walmart, 3M, Interact. We have governments. We have ISED. We have the National Research Council. We have NGOs. We have the Ashoka Foundation. These 20 organizations that innovate, and we bring them together once every quarter. And it's not executive education. It's in some ways executive engagement, that we're going to co-create this innovation model, a made in Canada approach to innovation that we can innovate so that creates value for the firm and value for society simultaneously. It will create value for the system, not just for themselves. I'm really excited about it, Mark, because that way it's us working together to solve the innovation challenges in new ways, and the participants will be the ones that co-create the knowledge and will allow us, like I said, with this made in Canada approach to innovation. And it will build the innovation economy here. I'm very excited.
I'm really lucky. I get a chance to hang around the Perimeter Institute a fair amount, and that is it's a very hopeful place, right? The orientation is around advancing humanity and solving some of the biggest problems, and I sense a whole lot of kind of a hopeful tone here in the model too, right? Everyone comes to the table with a positive attitude and a belief that change can transpire. And do you think that this is going to make a contribution to global innovation?
When you think about innovation, what is the word that comes to mind? Creative destruction. right? So we believe that we need to destroy the old. And that, even those two words, I love creative. The destruction means that we get rid of the old to replace it with the new. There's something wrong with that. And where did it germinate? Germinated, a lot of it was in Silicon Valley, right? And it's a very different scenario there. The problem, well, the innovation approach in Silicon Valley is very much on this internet platform. You just put on apps and they sort of work together, but they're not thinking about that larger system at all. It's very much about what can I get from this? And so you scale up just by trying to sell your app or technology, whatever it is. If we do this right, and I'm confident that we can, and we have a 5-year window in which we're going to solve this. In 5 years, by 2024, we are, I believe, going to have a new system of innovation that will start to shape global innovation. It will shape the view of how we think about companies in this hopeful piece, that companies will actually be the force for good, but not because they subscribe to sustainability or social responsibility, which, as you know, I believe in deeply, but because they understand the system and they're going to work with the system as opposed to against it.
Is there something about the Canadian context or the Canadian mindset that is important? I'm sure that was a very deliberate choice on your part to call on Canadian organizations as opposed to reaching into the US or globally or whatnot.
Yeah, Mark, you're right. I'm proudly Canadian. I have to be careful about saying that because there's patriotism, but there's patriotism at the cost of exclusion. But I think Canada has some amazing features, and those features are we have a very diverse public, and I think diversity is important. We have a very smart and educated community as well, and I think that's important in the innovation frontier. So we're diverse, we're educated, and we have social values that transcend just our own personal values. And I think that as we see what's happening in the world, I am so proud that Canada has dealt with the COVID situation fairly responsibly and shuttered it down so that we can rebuild the economy now. And so I think that if we're going to do this, Canada's a place. So why not start here? Why not take some of those assets that we have and amplify them, use them to create that solution that I think others can learn from, where we can punch way above our weight. And so we need to take that on. The
vision's fantastic. I'm glad I'm here, and I'm glad I get a front row seat to all this. It's fantastic.
Well, Mark, the Ivey Academy has been a really great friend of ours, so I am so lucky to have you guys as partners on this.
Thanks. I want to move us into our last territory, which is kind of a bit more on the practical side. But Sean, I just come to you first. Do we have we haven't even attempted to get to audience questions. Do we have anything coming in that we should try to get to right now?
I think most of the audience questions are actually perfect for our last pasture. One that I have highlighted here is how can incentive systems be improved to reward more systemic thinking and decision making? But when I look at the other questions, they're all similar in terms of, how do you get managers thinking in this way? How do you encourage it? How do you reinforce it? So I'm not sure if you have any reactions to that, Tima, or whether you think we'll cover that in our last pasture.
We will cover that in our last pasture, so maybe we should just move to that.
Perfect.
And then,
Great.
Then we'll leave some more time for additional questions on that. Mark, should I just?
Yeah, let's go there. We talked about this in the prep. I hear all the time. Our clients hear all the time. Kind of be agile. Be nimble. Collaborate more. But that's kind of where the advice stops. Like the advice is never about, by the way, here's how to do that. So that's kind of where I'd like to go next.
Yeah, and I said earlier in the Innovation Learning Lab that we're really trying to understand what this looks like, because to some extent, what we teach in business schools is that plan, do, check, act, right? And for a lot of the audience members, if you have a business degree, you would know that We learn how to calculate financial ratios. We try to value a firm, even though it's almost impossible now to value a firm, into the future. And you can see stock markets, just the volatility of stock markets just goes to show that value isn't something that's predictable. Okay, so then you have to, I think, build this notion of dynamic capabilities. So I'm going to go back to the soccer analogy, that when you're playing soccer, you don't try to calculate where the ball is going to go and all the variables. In some ways, that's where business thinking often goes. What you try to do is you try to embed those skills in individuals. So we're not talking about, just leadership. We're actually talking about dynamic capabilities. Nimble, you said it. Agile. Yeah, what does that mean? So let's use the soccer analogy, that you will learn to play the ball. You'll learn to see not just your skill set and the competitor that's right in front of you. You will see the whole field of play. So this ability to zoom in to what you're doing and zoom out is actually a cognitive realignment. And when do we talk about that? This cognitive reframing. So we have a tendency, like I said, to see things this way. But if someone forces you and says, okay, let's just look at the big picture, and then let's come back, and let's look at the big picture, and let's come back. And that training of going in and out is so powerful because it realigns your cognitive frame. It's training. It's not learning a new toolkit. It's a new way of thinking. That will help to remove some cognitive biases, but it'll also put things in view that you haven't seen before. And by zooming in and zooming out, I don't mean just zooming out to your industry. I mean zooming out, including society and the environment. I mean zooming to see more of the value chain, which crosses industries. I also mean zooming out to see the long term and the short term. And that ability, that play, I think is one really important key. And that's what I hope that we would be able to train in the program that we're going to have. Another one is that if you take a systems view, and we all know that we have biases and we can't all play every role on the pitch, on the soccer pitch, then what you need is you have to be able to co-create the solutions. Everybody brings different strengths to the table. How do you co-create? If you're a finance person, you're working with an engineer and an anthropologist and an ecologist, right? They're just like, we're all different skill sets. The process of co-creation goes beyond just collaboration. It requires us to be able to push through those tensions and this ability to hear other people's point of view and respect them. Because we have a tendency when we're biased to map everybody's insights into our own. What we need to do is to use those biases and really, really integrate them into our thinking. That's hard. So these are just two examples. I can go on if you want. So it depends on the questions of ways in which we can think differently to allow for a dynamic systems approach.
I think I've seen lots of evidence and lots of examples in the last few years about divergent points of view being interpreted as friction. Friction is a bad thing. Friction needs to be taken out, right? And so it sort of gets labeled as, oh, this person isn't a cultural fit here, not a fit. That person is silenced or pushed out of the organization. The friction goes away. You've got alignment on views, which is generally seen as positive, but you sort of end up back down the same road you've been down, kind of 100 times before. So I think you're saying don't interpret differing points of view as friction. Interpret that as the elimination of cognitive biases and an opportunity to learn and an opportunity to kind of get somewhere different.
Yeah. And then there's this orientation of play, this orientation of learning, an orientation towards creativity, all positive that take us away from friction tensions to generativity. And I think that that's training that we need to do. Like I say, there's a sports analogy here, but the sports analogy isn't to win. The sports analogy is to really create a really resilient organization that will outperform others in the long term, but it's not about the competition. It's really just about working within that.
For managers that they're thinking, what do I do with all this? I know you're an advocate for future perfect thinking and backcasting as an exercise, a pragmatic exercise. Can you just explain that a bit and help the audience think about how they might do that in their organization?
So the COVID example is a perfect one, and we had to pivot on a dime, right? That everybody did, and we did actually. It's amazing how fast we learn. In fact, if anything gives me optimism about dealing with some of the world's problems, is the fact that we responded so quickly to COVID. So that forced us to think short term. That forced us to say, what do I do now? Future perfect thinking says, okay, let's extend that and say 5 years on, 10 years on, whatever time frame you want. And it has to be a reasonable time frame that you can, it doesn't become meaningless. So let's just say 5 years on, we've now dealt with COVID. You, Mark, are going to receive, you're a CEO of a power generation company. You're going to receive an award. When you receive this award, what are you going to say that you accomplished in that 5 years? What is that world or that vision that you saw? As soon as you're forced to think that, you will think beyond how do I get to work in the morning, right? It's because of COVID. You will then say, how have I transformed my organization to respond to this meaningfully? That's future perfect. You envision yourself, you break your cognitive biases. Imagine then doing that with a group of people. You even break it even more because you all have these shared different visions of what that could be. And then you backcast and say, okay, now, what do I do now, very specifically, to get to that award that I'm going to win? It's a different way of thinking. And everything that we do right now anchors on the present and forces us to look further into the future.
I mean, so much of planning and budgeting, at least in a traditional sense, is about starting here and moving forward, and everything is incremental. Nothing is zero based. Everything is sort of an increment from here. So it's such a different way of thinking.
I started my career in the oil industry, believe it or not. I was an economist, and I used to do regression analysis and try to forecast demand of natural gas and oil, and regression analysis, and all of that means that I don't know if you know, I don't even know if the audience would know enough about this, but you have a model, and all models are built on what? Historical data. Yeah. And if they're all built on historical data, and then you try to say, okay, what will be demand in the future? What you've done is just retain the status quo. And the status quo, especially in the economics that I learned, did not assume that there is limits to growth, that there would someday be a point when we have too much carbon in the atmosphere and even less oil in the ground. So it's not a dynamic system. Economics cannot model dynamics, and we need a very different way of thinking.
Never in 1 million years would I've guessed that you started in the oil industry.
Yeah, here I am, right? Sustainability to the core.
We don't have a ton of time left. As always, we're kind of up against it. So I do want to come back to some audience questions. Maybe we start with that compensation question. Sean, could you just restate it?
Sure. So the question was, how can incentive systems be improved to reward more systemic thinking and decision making?
And the difficulty is I can't ask the audience member what they meant by incentive systems, because there's public policy incentive systems as well as organizational incentive systems. But I think that I'm going to go with public policy. I guess maybe that's the advantage, is I get to choose the way they interpret the problem or the question. So I think that right now, if government was thinking in systems, then they had to deal with it here and now with, let's say, COVID, and ensure that people have food on the table. But if they had thought then about the incentive systems into the future and COVID becomes a pivot point, then they would have said, okay, what is the incentives that I need to create for that future that will create a better world? And that incentive system then would have had something to do with, we will fund, for example, organizations that will create greater resiliency. Let's say local resiliency in supply chains. Fund organizations that that will move towards a green economy. Fund organizations are going to hire local people or students, whatever it is. And so the incentive systems then have that future, almost that future perfect orientation that makes the system better.
Sean, what else is coming in from the audience that we should get to?
There's one question here that I thought was interesting. It's how can organizations operate in a manner where they're ready for any uncertainty? So like you, Tima, I'm actually putting a bit of interpretation on this one myself and thinking about this in terms of is it possible that coronavirus would encourage this kind of innovation, encourage systems thinking, but limit the way that people are thinking about it? So they're really just thinking about uncertainty as coronavirus, right? How do you think about uncertainty in a broader sense? How do you make sure that you're really sensing and responding to the big picture?
That's a really good point, because I think, I don't know about you, I'm sure everybody in the first weeks of the coronavirus were just like watching our devices saying what's going on, right? And it really did just focus our attention on the coronavirus when there's so much systems change on the horizon. And some of those other pieces I've just said, but the financial crises are obvious. And you never know that from the stock market, which is recovering. But what's really happening underneath that is that Wall Street or the technology sectors are sort of overriding a lot of what's happening on Main Street. And so there's a lot of that will likely be systemic unemployment. There's technological issues at play right now that, fintech is just really changing things. We're seeing virtual technologies as we do here, changing the future of work. How do we see all of that? And that's, I think, once again, we have to think about that larger system. If you look at that larger system, I'll tell you, this is what I study. And all those factors, those interconnection of all those dynamics really come into play. And the word cloud that you started with, Sean, is sort of gets to the fact that people are seeing those larger macro disruptions, and put together, we can see that. One of my big fears, this is Shamark going back earlier to the oil industry. I started in the oil industry, and right now I worry that the oil industry is very much focused on protecting what they have, rather than embracing the future possibilities of what they could do.
I mean, particularly in a world where there's a double whammy. There's the pandemic effect, and then there's the current sort of impact on pricing and price wars. I'm not giving anybody a pass, but easy to understand why the focus would be on sort of protecting what's in front of them, or kind of protecting the near term, when there's so much of an onslaught right now.
And yet I could argue that this has been on the horizon for a while right now, and having zoomed out or being a little bit more open to diverse opinions may have put these ideas more into view. And if you look at the companies in the oil industry in Alberta, you can see that some were far more prescient about what's going on. And going on into the insides, where a lot of my research is, it's really clear the diversity of perspectives that some companies accommodate versus others squeeze out.
We've only a couple of minutes left. Tima, any closing thoughts from you before we kind of wrap it up with logistics and whatnot?
No, I appreciate this opportunity. I just really think that that the way that we've been thinking about business and thinking has had its day, and we need a new way of approaching the way that we manage organizations. And I do think a dynamic systems approach, where we sort of embrace some of that metaphor of playing in sport, that there's a lot of complexity that's going on, but we can still play really well. I think that there's something to leverage here.
And we've managed to talk about sport and fashion, which are the only two things I really care about. So,
and me as well. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, John.
Sean, can you remind everyone about the upcoming program and what happens next with this recording, please?
Sure, thanks. So as I mentioned, you can find all of our past episodes on iveyacademy.com/blog. You can also register for upcoming programs and learn more at /programs. We'll also be sending out an emailed link to the recording later today that you can share with your colleagues. And thank you for tuning in.
Tima, great job today. It's fantastic. Thanks for making time for all the prep and thanks for doing this today. I appreciate it. Just so insightful. Thank you.
Thanks again, Mark and Sean.
On behalf of Ivey and to our entire audience, thank you, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Do I leave?